Um, and like any good host, I realized that I needed to know something about the books before I started asking them questions. But I have to be honest with you, I have very, very little time. And I thought that what I was going to do was really just skim the books, just enough so that I could ask some smart questions. And you bastards, you wrote such good books. I just kept reading and reading and reading. And yes, didn't get any other work done, but enjoyed the books enormously and learned a tremendous amount from them. And I want to start by congratulating both of you on them, because they are tremendous works. And I'll tell you, I guess, as someone who's been working on Iran for almost 40 years now, what I found most interesting about the two books was the juxtaposition of how the two of you came at them. So Ross Harrison, who is a senior fellow here, is also a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And as I think Ross will be the first to tell you, he is not an expert on Iran, although Ross knows a hell of a lot about Iran. And that absolutely comes through in the book. Mohsen Milani, on the other hand, professor at the University of South Florida, is one of the great experts on Iran. And both of them, the two books that they've written, are both looking at more or less the same set of issues. Iran's foreign policy, its strategy, its approach toward the world. But of course, they come at it each from their own perspective. And what I loved in reading both books sequentially was seeing how each of you were approaching the same topic from your different vantage points. So of course, Mohsen brings decades of tremendous fine-grained knowledge of Iran, of the Iranian people, of the Iranian political system. And the book is a way of understanding Iran and Iran's foreign policy from the inside out. Now, again, he also knows a tremendous amount about the Middle East. He understands Iran's regional situation. But again, what really came through was that sense of, the deep understanding of Iran, its people, its culture, its government, and how that projects into the foreign policy. Ross, of course, is a professor of security, of international relations, of strategy. And Ross's book looks at the very same question from the perspective of a strategist, looking at the same sets of issues a little bit more from the outside. And again, together, the juxtaposition was absolutely fantastic. Thinking about the same set of absolutely critical issues from these two different perspectives. Now, again, Mohsen is no slouch when it comes to strategy, so you find a lot of that in his book. And as I've also said, Ross is no slouch when it comes to Iran. And I will also put, Ross has done a tremendous amount of work on this book. He's been thinking about Iran for a long period of time. He has some wonderful little vignettes from interviews that he did with Iranian presidents and foreign ministers over the years. Those were some that I really was like, that's great, I need more of that, right? Just, print the entire transcript of the interview there. But, again, bringing that perspective and seeing these two perspectives together, I just thought was phenomenal, right? And again, as someone who has read a lot on Iran and written a lot on Iran, it was nonetheless wonderful to get Mohsen's kind of from the inside out and Ross's from the outside in perspective. They're actually a wonderful complement. And Ross, you were the one who first proposed this idea of doing the joint event. I don't know if you realized that at the time. I just thought, oh yeah, I like Ross, I like Mohsen. We should absolutely bring them up here together, not recognizing just how wonderful the synergies were going to be with your two fantastic books.
Thank you.
All right, the way we're going to do things today is I'm going to start by asking Ross and Mohsen a series of questions, which I hope are going to hit the high points for everybody out there, right? The things that you're going to most want to hear from them. And we'll talk for a while, and then we will open things up to questions, both from folks here in the room with us and from the folks online. And I've got an iPad, and inshallah, the technology will work, and I will alternate questions from the folks in the room and the folks online. So for the folks online, you simply can use the raise hand function. Yeah, we're using, yeah. So simply use the raise hand function on Zoom, and I will call on you in the order that you raise your hands. But I want to start here. Ross, Mohsen, as I said, your books are wonderful because, what I got from them was simultaneous. There's so much complementarity. There's so much commonality that you both see, but there are also some important differences, right? And so where I wanted to start was give us a sense of what drove you to write the book. As someone who's written 10 going on 11 books myself, I mean, it is an act of madness. We all know, Churchill's famous quote about finally throwing the monster out the door onto the public. So, what drove you to the acts of madness to write books on the foreign policy, the grand strategy of the Islamic Republic? Mohsen, why don't you start us off?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ken, for your kind introduction. I wish you would have made it a little bit longer. And you would have praised us a little bit more, but thank you very much.
I'll add that in as we go along, Mohsen. That's easy.
Thank you for inviting us, and I want to express my gratitude to the Middle East Institute, its board members for organizing this. And it's a great honor to be with you and with Ross. I also have to say that you yourself are one of the best experts on Iran. As a matter of fact, I used your book on U.S.-Iran relations, Persian Puzzle, in one of my classes, and that's a few years ago. And Ross, I got to know him about 4 or 5 years ago. We've had happy hour conversations online, and it's very difficult for me to catch up with him. But we had absolutely no discussion about our books. But as you correctly said, it's complementary. Now, as to your question, why I decided to write this book, as a writer, the key to writing a good book, and I'm not saying my book is good, but the key to writing any book is, A, you have to have enthusiasm about what you're doing. Secondly, you have to have a question. I wrote my first book because I was fascinated about the making of the Iranian Revolution. And the question I tried to answer in my book, how was it possible for the revolutionaries to overthrow a fortified regime, such as the regime of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi? And I think I provided an answer. Now, in the second book, there are 2 questions I wanted to answer in this book. The first question is, how was it possible for a country that has been under US containment policies for over 4 decades, has been subject of the harshest sanctions? How was it possible for that regime to become a formidable player in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, and in Gaza? How was it possible? And I provide an answer to that question. But the second question, perhaps even more important than the first one, is that rise sustainable? So the first part of the book is the question of how was it possible for Iran to become a major power? And I try to answer this question by looking at 2 major variables. I argue in the book that the Islamic Revolution provided the energy, provided the leadership, and the will to expand Iranian power. That will is the key, the will to expand Iranian power, and not being afraid of it. The Shah tried to expand Iranian power, but he was a little bit shy about it. These guys are not. And the second factor I looked at is the critical role of war in making of the Islamic Republic. It is said, Charles Tilly once said, that wars make states. States don't make wars, but war makes states. And if you look at the Iranian activities in the past 40 years, you see that Iran was involved in the Iran-Iraq war. It was involved in war in Lebanon. It was involved in the civil war in Syria, in Yemen, everywhere. So Iran took advantage of that, and recognizing that there is a huge power disparity between the United States and Iran tried to resort to asymmetrical war strategies. And finally, I look at one key factor. I argue in the book that Iranian rise became possible because of one key factor, American invasion of Iraq. That invasion became catalyst for which Iran was able to expand its power. And then at the end of the book, I argue, and I wrote the book before the fall of Assad. I wrote the book before the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. I argued in that book that this rise is unsustainable. It is unsustainable because A, Iran is relying too much on non-state actor in an age where state is the major player. It is unsustainable because Iran keeps spending money and not getting anything in return. It is unsustainable for perhaps the most important reason. Iranian ambition was far beyond its capabilities. Iran declared war on the United States, declared war on Israel, and Iran simply does not have the capability to sustain that. And finally, the last point I make, and I'm going to stop, is that I said the Shah of Iran was overthrown at the peak of his power in 1979 because of lack of political legitimacy at home. And I argue that the Islamic Republic is facing the same problem. And unless they fundamentally reform their foreign policy and they fundamentally make some changes internally, the likelihood of Iran being able to sustain that are very, very unlikely.
Ross, since Mohsen also anticipated my next question, so do the same thing.
Okay.
Why'd you write this? And yeah, give us the what's your book about answer
Okay.
as well.
First of all, I want to thank Ken Yu for supporting this project. You know, the book started under the leadership of Paul Salem here at the Middle East Institute. And the book was finished really last October, but it went through the editing process. And it was just about to be released when you when the new regime hit here, when you became the vice president for the policy center here. So I want to thank you for the support. That was not clear to me when you came on board that I would have that support. So I want to thank you. There are a few other people just quickly I want to thank also that are in the room. First of all, Paul Salem is not here. He's on an airplane right now, but I want to thank his support. Alex Vatanka, obviously Iran expert, who was very helpful. Sharok Fardoost, who was a dear friend, who senior economist from the World Bank and was extremely helpful to me, lending his time on the economics front in terms of helping me think through Iran's economic approach to the world. And I also want to thank somebody that's in the back of the room, Gaten James. I mean, I had a number of different research assistants sponsored by the Middle East Institute, by the way. But the one that really shines, they're all good, but the one that really shines is Gaten James, because he was not just a research assistant, he was actually a partner in a way. We did interviews together, some very profound interviews, some funny interviews, and he was very helpful in synthesizing the interviews and helping distill it down. One of the best I've seen. So thank you, Gaten, for that kind of support. In terms of writing the book, the motivation was twofold, Ken. First one, as I had read a number of different treatises on Iranian national security strategy. And I was at times, I mean, they were extremely well done, but I felt there was something missing. And that is that they chronicled the doctrines at times and the actions, but the underpinning strategic elements I thought at times were missing. So I thought that having been a student of strategy and having written a book on strategy 12 years earlier, that I had something to offer. And then the work here I did at the Middle East Institute with Paul Salem focused on regional issues. So from regional cooperation or the lack thereof, civil wars in the Middle East. So I felt I had the ability to look at Iran's strategic environment, if not Iran itself, and that would give me a leg up. And so I decided maybe I had something to offer, and that was the motivation for the book. But there's also a personal part, and that is that I happened to fall in love with a lovely Iranian lady about 40 years ago, who happens to be in the room. It's my wife now, going on 38 years. And I sensed something in 2015 that I had not seen in her, and that was a certain hope for the future, a hope for U.S. interests vis-a-vis the Middle East and for the Iranian people, and that was the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. That this was a bet, it wasn't a sure thing, but it was a bet on the future. And it checked the boxes of her identity, both as an Iranian and as an American, that it was advancing U.S. interest, we felt at the time, and also Iranian interest. And then I saw the reverse in 2018 when the United States walked away from the nuclear deal. the sort of desperation of this was not good for the United States, in our view, and it was not, certainly didn't do any, the sort of betrayal of the Iranian people in a way. So I felt like I needed to do something in my own small way to give a fair appraisal of Iran's foreign policy, neither being an apologist for explaining away the worst actions of Iran in the region and at home, but also not condemning Iran just for being Iran. So that was sort of the motivation, two motivations, professional and personal. In terms of what the book argues, there's a thread throughout the book, and that is that Iran has a particular paradox, a particular issue, and that is that it has extremely large goals, but proportionally smaller means to achieve those goals. And that goes back, by the way, a couple thousand years. If you think about the start of the Persian Empire, 2,500 years ago, it was an innovation. It was the first world superpower in many ways. And so and most Iranians that I know, certainly the one that I live with, have a very proud sense of the Persian Empire and what they've delivered in terms of, both in terms of power creation, in terms of literature, in terms of poetry and music. I hear that all the time at the dinner table. But since that time, Iran has been cut down to size. The Persian Empire was cut down to size, first by the Greeks in the BC era, and then in the AD era, the Arabs, and then later on through the Safavid dynasty, the Qajar dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, we saw Iran under the influence of Great Britain and Russia, and then Great Britain and then the Soviet Union, and then the United States and the Soviet Union. So Iran has this sort of dialectic. They have a large view of itself, but proportionally smaller means to achieve that. And so my argument, the main thread of the book is, this is a continuous thread. This does not start with the Islamic Republic. It didn't even start with the Pahlavi dynasty. It goes back a long ways. And that when we look at Iran, we need to understand that this is about the generation of power. How do we generate power? It was something that existed during the Pahlavi dynasty, during Reza Shah himself in the 1920s. How can we create a modern state that can withstand the international system coming at it? We saw it during his sons, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. How do we create political power? And we've seen it with the Islamic Republic itself. How do we create political power? The argument I make in the book is that the adversaries of Iran, Israel and the United States, for the most part, follow what we call Clausewitzian strategic principles. Clausewitz basically talked about center of gravity, and it's a mechanical model of how to think about strategy. And we developed that, the United States developed that during the Cold War. But what Iran has done over the last, certainly since the revolution, a bit before the revolution, since the revolution, is follow, wittingly or unwittingly. I never saw any evidence that Iranian leaders embraced Sun Tzu. But in a way, Iran embraced some of the principles of Sun Tzu, which is you try to avoid a direct confrontation if you possibly can. It's about indirect confrontation, it's about psychology. And what Sun Tzu talks about is, rather than concentrating power and concentrating resources, that creates, concentration of power is necessary to create power, but it also creates vulnerabilities. You should actually diffuse power. He uses a metaphor, take on the shape of water. And if you think about the conversations, direct and indirect, between General Petraeus in Iraq and the late Major General Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Quds Force, that's what was happening in Iraq. Iran was insinuating itself into the fabric of Iraq at a time when the Americans were right there in plain sight. And very different strategies. So I argued in the book that Iran's creation of power and influence occurred using these asymmetric means, their alliances with militias and so forth, and that this was their way to counter concentrated power. It was an asymmetric means. I also offer in the book, and I mentioned it yesterday in Brian's podcast, was that road, that pathway that Iran was on, is now a dead end. That since the United States and Israel and Iran have conflicted with one another directly, not indirectly, that's what Sun Tzu would recommend, but directly, the ability for Iran to rebuild this axis of resistance in a way that creates the effects, the strategic effects that it had before, that availability or that option is really not available to Iran in many ways. At least I argue that in the book. The other thing that I argue in the book, and then I'll stop in a minute here, is that in many ways, Iran's strategy was a blocking strategy. It was a strategy of denial. It was there, yes, it created deterrence, and it may have even created a sense of regime survival, but it basically was designed, their presence in Syria and Iraq and in Lebanon and in Yemen, to deny the Arab states from reintegrating these four countries into the Arab fold. Because remember, Mohsen mentioned the Iran-Iraq War. That was a foundational episode for Iran's foreign policy. They never wanted to have Arab power arrayed together again. And so this was partially a denial strategy. Well, that also has come to an end. Syria now has fallen out, is on a different path. Lebanon, ideally, is hopefully on a different path. So the notion of somehow denying the Arab states the reintegration of these states into the Arab fold, that may also have been passed. The last piece I'll say is that in many ways, Iran, I argue in the book, has been an absolute first-rate adapter, but a second and third-rate shaper. In other words, they have been able to adapt largely to the failures of others. The failed region after 2011, 2012, when the region collapses into civil war, they adapted to that in a very, in many ways, a brilliant tactical, and I would argue maybe strategic way. And they adapted also to the failures of the United States in Iraq and the failures of Saudi Arabia, perhaps in Yemen. So they built their strategy on the failures of others in many ways, artfully, masterfully. There were risks. It was not risk-free. But Mohsen has instructed me on that over the last number of years. This was not a given, but they were incredible tactical adapters. But in terms of now they have a situation where they have to compete directly. They have to actually compete with success, not with failure. Perhaps success on the part of the Israelis, maybe success on the part of the United States, certainly successful economic models with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So the question going forward is, can they compete with success and develop a model that is not just based upon the principles of Sun Tzu, but actually compete directly with their adversaries in a way that is accretive to the interests of the Iranian people. That's where Iran is at a strategic crossroads. They can't go back to the status quo ante. They can try, but not with the same strategic effect. And they are at a crossroads where they're probably going to have to compete economically and politically, maybe even militarily, with their adversaries and the region writ large.
Outstanding. All right, thank you both. One of the things I always hate when I get to book talks is I get asked a lot of questions about what's in my book, what's in my book, what's my book, and I always feel like by the end of it, the audience is thinking, well, that's great. I have everything I need to know from the book. There's no reason to buy it. So I'm not going to keep asking you guys. Instead, because we're in Washington, and as Ross has already kind of laid the path, I want to talk about Iran, Iran today, talk a little bit about Iran in the future, but I'm not going to ask you to do any predicting. Using the two books to inform your thinking and helping us to better understand Iran, what it's been up to, where it might go, based on all of the wisdom in your books. So Mohsen, I want to start with you. As you pointed out, your book doesn't cover some of the most recent events. Books have to go into publication, and unfortunately, these countries refuse to stop doing things, even after we put the books into publication. I want you to tackle it this way. I mean, again, you also made this point. It's one of the things, again, that I love about the book is the continuity that you both see in Iranian foreign policy over not just the decades, but the centuries, the millennia. And again, I see that as well. You both do, I think, a very nice job talking about how the revolution does change some things, it brings some new features in, but that there's a lot more continuity than there is real divergence. And I think, again, that's one of the great strengths of both books, and to see them together. Mohsen, let me start with you. Lay those factors forward into the recent conflict, right? Help us to understand how Iran thought about both the Israeli war with Iran in June, but also the wider conflict across the Middle East, and how those were informed by these deeper well springs of Iranian foreign policy that you talk about so beautifully.
I remember September 10th, America was a divided country, more or less. September 11th, America became a country in state of shock. And September 12th, a new America was born. I think we had Israel's September 11th when Hamas attacked it. And we had Iran's September 11th when Israel attacked Iran. And I think we are beginning to see the birth of a new Iran, perhaps a new Islamic Republic or some sort of republic. Iranians expected some kind of attack, but they did not expect the kind of attack that took place. It shook the Iranian leadership. As you know, in the first 24 hours, at least 20 to 30 of top Iranian decision makers were killed. 10 to 15 of top nuclear scientists were assassinated. And I think some people in Tel Aviv and Washington thought that that could be the beginning of internal implosion and collapse of the Islamic.
Might be the
Hope, yes, and hope is no strategy. It didn't happen. So that was the first shock. But the second shock was how quickly the Islamic Republic was able to reorganize itself. People don't give enough credit to this. They give a lot of credit to the American and Israeli attack. But to me, that the attack was a masterpiece of military planning and intelligence penetration. But the way the Iranians recovered also is books are going to be written about how they were able to do that. Imagine top 20 generals of any Middle Eastern country is assassinated in 24 hours. Can they recover? My answer is perhaps with the exception of Israel, perhaps Turkey, no other state. But they recovered and they started attacking. However, that said, we're talking about a new reality in Iran. Iran today is not in the same geopolitical position it was 4 years ago. In that book, I have argued, and in the last program I had with you, which you moderated, and it was a fantastic program, I made that point that the decline of Iranian influence in the region did not start with the Israeli attack on Iran. It started when General Qasem Soleimani was assassinated. I think Soleimani was a unique kind of a general. He was the real force behind Iran's axis of resistance. He was charismatic, and he had complete support of the top leadership in Iran. He could make on-spot decisions. But there was something else about him that with his death disappeared from Iranian geopolitical thinking. And that is Qasem Soleimani believed in both defensive as well as offensive operations. With his death, I think one part of that equation disappeared, the offensive part of it. And Iran essentially became defensive. Today, the reality is that Iranian power has declined significantly. I don't think Iran is out. This is where I disagree with Ross. I think it is too early to say what Iran is going to do. Iran has still some options. I think the axis of resistance has been weakened, but definitely is not out. I think both Iranian leadership and the leadership of axis of resistance are recalibrating, rethinking, of re-emerging perhaps in a different form, in different shape. The axis of resistance is not going to be the same as before. So Iran has to make a big decision. That is why I think Iran, we're talking about a new Iran. They have to make a number of important decisions, and they haven't made those decisions yet. Number one, do they want to go the nuclear path?
Don't give an answer to that, because
No,
I'm
I
going to ask
won't.
you that in a little bit.
Because even if I
promise.
knew the answer, I wouldn't give it.
Well, I'm
I
going to
won't.
ask you, so you're going to have 10 minutes to think up an answer.
All right, very good. Secondly, Do they want to go and revive the access based on the model they had before, which I think would be a mistake. My own way of thinking is that the best alternative for them, and they haven't asked my advice, and even if they would have asked my advice, I would not have given it to them, but I give it to you. I would say consolidate what is left of the access, but you have to change the way you were supporting the access. Supporting militias operating independently in the different countries is not the way to go about doing things. In that book, in my conclusion, I make the same point. I said, is Iran willing to accept a militia, foreign-based militia operating in Iran? If the answer is no, why do you want to do the same in Syria and other countries? So they have to change that. But even more important than the other two is that Iran has to move toward normalizing relations with the US. This business of focusing on nuclear and nuclear only is dead end. It's not going to go anywhere. Iran has to move toward normalization of relations, and in the context of that normalization of relations, the nuclear issue and other issues have to be addressed. And finally, the key part is that no rise, no Iranian expansion in the region is sustainable until and unless there is popular support for it inside Iran. And I submit to you that popular support has diminished significantly. I don't know what percentage of Iranian society supports it. I know there are experts in Washington, they know the answer. They talked about 85.3%. I have no idea where they get that information. I don't know how the hell they can come out with this statement that we represent the people. Who are you? What segment of the Iranian society? Iran is a country of 93 million people. 93 million people. And some people have the audacity in Washington to come and say they represent Iran. On what basis? What polling? So, however, that much I know, based on traveling to Iran, based on talking to a lot of people, it's my impression that a significant portion of Iranian middle class and the youth of Iran do not like what Iran is doing in the region. They want to live a normal life. They want to have normal relations with the US. Therefore, whoever succeeds Ayatollah Khamenei, whoever wants to be compatible with new Iran, they have to move in that direction. That's the bottom line.
May I respond to him in one moment?
You absolutely, I want you to respond for more than one moment, Ross, because what I want you to do is I want you to pick up on exactly where Mohsen left us off and take the experience of the war and then translate it back into these deeper historical patterns that you see of Iranian strategic thinking and how you think that it may either reinforce or potentially change them, which I think gives you the opportunity to comment on Mohsen's points as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to what Mohsen said, I'm certainly not predicting Iran's path. What I am saying, and then I'll answer your question, Ken, going back, taking the thread backwards a bit, is that the enemy gets a vote as to the effectiveness of one strategy, right? And if you look at the enemy right now for Iran, it's been Israel and the United States at this point, but certainly principally Israel. And their strategy, you and I have talked about this, Ken, in terms of this notion of forward defense, that Iran had this forward defense strategy, and Israel has come back to it, to a forward defense strategy. So the notion that somehow Iran, I'm not saying Iran can or cannot rebuild its axis of resistance. I'm saying the strategic benefit of that is going to be very different. You can't go back to the status quo ante, not in terms of their behavior, but in terms of their effect. And I think to your question, Ken, in terms of, I mean, the way I look at Iran, and I don't address this in the book per se, because I'm not an expert in terms of the internal workings of Iran, but Iran learned a number of lessons from the Iran-Iraq War, and also from the regimes that have collapsed, from Saddam Hussein regime to Muammar Gaddafi's regime, to the Assad regime. And for the Iranians, the key, the North Star for the Iranians is regime survival. It's not the only North Star. You could say that they're also trying to hew to Iran's national interest, perhaps, but regime survival is key. And most of the point you raised about the fact that how they've been able to regroup, part of that is by design, not just design since the 12-day war, but the way they built their political system and their institutions is far less brittle. It's more dynamic and more diversified. Power is, yes, the supreme leader is the most powerful among many centers of power. So they built their system for resilience. And that is a thread, I think, going back in time, that they've learned the lessons from the past, certainly from the Shah himself and then the way in which that collapsed, but they've also learned it from the Iran-Iraq War and the collapses that have occurred in the region. So I think in terms of thinking about the 12-day war, I think that one of the principles that they clearly have to be focusing on, how do they generate political power? How do they recreate? Mohsen mentioned they're weakened, but they're not out. That's absolutely true. So how do they create leverage? And I think what they're probably, I was interviewed actually this morning by an Arab press, and they said, well, is Iran, are they sincere about negotiations? And I said, well, I don't know what's in their hearts in terms of sincerity, but I can tell you, if you look at their actions in terms of President Pezeshkian and others going to Beijing, they're trying to figure out how in this post 12-day war environment, they can create leverage and power in terms of negotiation. And I think also one of the things that is a carryover from the past is that you don't trust outside powers, and you certainly don't trust superpowers. Even a country like Russia, I mean, they've been disappointed by Russia and China in their response to the 12-day war, but certainly in the United States. So I think one of the questions that they have to be grappling with, I don't know this for sure, I'll be meeting with President Pezeshkian in a couple of weeks, be something I'll ask him, but one of the questions, how do they, since they can't trust the United States, that's clear in the Iranian mindset, they can't trust the United States, how do they trust their own power vis-a-vis their ability to negotiate? And that is a throwback to the Iran-Iraq War, what they've learned from the Iran-Iraq War. It's a throwback to their pre-revolutionary foreign policy threads. And my hunch is that's what they're trying to do, is try to figure out how to reconstitute and rejigger their power formulation in a way principally that ensures regime survival at a time when Iran is likely to go through a succession struggle anyway. And how can they do it in a way that gives them the negotiating leverage they need vis-a-vis the international community? Hopefully, something we haven't talked about, hopefully in a way that also benefits the Iranian people, something that we have seen missing in Iranian foreign policy, arguably since the revolution.
Outstanding. All right, I want to.
May I just add something to what
No.
he's, no.
Yeah, of course.
I like that.
Melissa, I promise I'm going to give you an opportunity to do so. But
right.
before we do that, I want to move to the nuclear issue,
Okay.
and then we're going to come back to this
Okay.
question
Sure.
of where does Iran go in the future? And
You're
I
the
promise
boss.
to give you first dibs. But I do want to get the nuclear issue on the table because, look, I think you both know I've always felt the United States overemphasized the nuclear issue with Iran. I felt that we made it the be-all and the end-all, and it was only part of a much larger set of issues out there. That said, you both have wonderful discussions of it in your books. And again, I think that the complementarity is terrific, and that you both tell a very similar story, which is always great, but each of you emphasizes a different perspective based on where you're coming from. And so what I'd like each of you to do, I'm not saying you tend to, again, tell the story from the Iranian perspective. Ross tends to come at it more from the strategic perspective. For both of you, I want you to, again, one of the great questions facing the United States and Israel and so many countries in the world right now is this question of what is Iran going to do with its nuclear program moving forward. Feel free to predict if you want to, but I'm also fine with you simply saying, look, this is what I saw. This is where the program came from. This is why Iran did what it did. And that therefore suggests to me that this is how they're likely to handle it in the future, right? And really, I think, we can all bet on what they're going to do, and we're going to talk about Khamenei and the Guard in a second. But, where you guys really bring such tremendous value added is in that deep insight and that long-term thinking about these problems that, frankly, most Americans just don't have. So as I said, I'm much more interested in you explaining, where the program came from and how you think that will shape their thinking about their nuclear program moving forward than I am, will they do it, won't they do it? So Mohsen starts off.
I think one of the greatest challenges for any social scientist or political scientist is to be able to distinguish between fad and trend. Fad is something that becomes fashionable and then it disappears after 2 years. But a trend is something that is sustainable. I think what I see, the development of two trends after Iran's 9/11. One is about how within the Iranian governing elite, people have become openly outspoken about normalizing relations with the United States. This was not in the cards before 9/11. Hashemi Rafsanjani, one of the great leaders of the Islamic Republic, in his memoirs says that he had a meeting with Ayatollah Khomeini before he died. And he turned to Khomeini. He was very close to Ayatollah Khomeini. He was one of his students in the 1960s and a confidant of Khomeini. He said that I turned Ayatollah Khomeini, there are two things you have to do. Number one, put an end to this war with Iraq. Finish it. Finish it in a way that we don't have to revisit it. That's number one. And he said, number two, you're the only one who can save this country from catastrophe by putting an end to this animosity toward the United States. Well, we know that it didn't happen. Ayatollah Khomeini took over and he had pursued a different policy. But if you look at the Iranian newspapers today, they openly talk about normalizing relations with the United States. This is unique. And I think this creates a fantastic opportunity for Washington to, rather than putting so much emphasis on overthrowing, which is not going to be easy, as you know better than anyone else, regime change is very attractive in Washington, but very difficult to do, and then to practice, and then to achieve the goal you wanted, because the rule of unintended consequence is always there. That's number one. But the second thing that is worrisome to me, that I also see, I don't remember saying so many young Iranians, analysts, openly talking about Iran taking the nuclear path, pushing for that, because their argument is that Iranian deterrence has collapsed completely. Reliance on non-state actors, reliance on axis of resistance did not stop the Israelis to attack, did not stop two nuclear powers to attack a non-nuclear power. And that unless Iran develops a nuclear bomb, there is no way Iran can protect itself. So there is that push. Now, whether this is a push that is sanctioned by the Islamic Republic or it's genuine, I do not know. But what I do know, and I have talked to some Iranians who are not political at all, they say the same thing. They said the nuclear path is the only thing that is left. I don't know what happens, what will happen, and I don't want to predict. What I can tell you is that these two problems are unlikely to be resolved unless there is a new leadership in Tehran. Ayatollah Khomeini is 86 years old. He seems to be pretty healthy, although we have so many doctors who can say that he's about to die, and they've been saying that for years. As long as he's there, I don't think you're going to see a major change in Iranian attitude toward the United States. Now, regarding the nuclear bomb, I don't know. That is the unknown, and I do not want to speculate. But all I can tell you, there is more support for it today in Iran than the support for it before. And how these things are going to unfold depends on two critical factors. The succession to Ayatollah Khomeini, is that going to be somebody, if it is done, if there is no unexpected events, a coup d'etat or regime change, but if we stay with the course, who's going to replace him? I submit to you, Ken, that whoever was supposed to replace him is not going to replace him anymore. I think the attack has changed the calculation of the top leadership of Iran. And who that person is going to be, I don't know. So that's factor number one. And factor number two, if there is another attack on Iran. 2 weeks before the US and Israel attack Iran, I wrote a piece for foreign policy. And I said, Iran is not as weak as you think it is. And in that, I argued that if there is an attack, don't expect people to take to the streets and support the regime change. No one does that. You don't have to be a genius to figure this out, Ken. When America was attacked, everybody rallied.
Is the history of strategic bombing.
That is the case. Now, if there is a second attack, even if that attack succeeds in overthrowing the regime, I think there is going to be incredible support, popular support for Iran taking the nuclear path. That is why I hope that we do not have to go through another war. I hope that there could be a peaceful resolution of the conflict with the United States. And I hope, and I said that last time, and I received some nasty emails, and I hope that Iran can reevaluate its policy toward Israel as well.
Ross, how about you? What is your long look at Iranian strategy give you a sense of in terms of the nuclear program and where it may be headed?
Well, first of all, Ken, it really saddens me to say I violently agree with Mohsen. It really, that's number one. And pretty much
Ross,
everything he
do
said.
me a favor.
What?
Stop it. Let him ask the next question.
Oh. No, I think if you look at the arc of Iran's nuclear program, which I think is what you asked initially, which is going back in time, it started during the Shah's era. This was not an initiative that started under the Islamic Republic. But I think if you look at the motivation for Iran, I think there's multiple motivations. One is clearly prestige. You know, it's not just about deterrence and defense and the things that we've been talking about. There is a prestige factor that Iran has a program. It's got under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is a signatory, by the way, and there's other states, some other states in the region, like Israel, are not signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, even though they violated that principles in 2003. The Iranians did. They still believe that program there's a prestige factor to Iran at least being able to enrich uranium, not necessarily moving towards a weapon, but enriching uranium. And I think that factor is something that at least the Obama administration understood in 2013 after President Rouhani was elected. And when they were negotiating, basically what changed was not so much the Iranian position, it was more the American position, which is you have the right to enrich, but you don't have the right to enrich to high degrees that would militate or move you towards a nuclear weapon. And so that was one of, aside from the sanctions and the leverage that was created, there was also an acknowledgement. Iranians are incredibly proud people. And the notion that somehow that they could be denied an enrichment capability was a red line for them. And I would argue probably is still a red line today. Not 100%. I'm not quite as clear on that today, but there's a red line. But there was the other piece too, which is what Mohsen was talking about, which was the question of deterrence and strategigic effect. In other words, what did the nuclear program give them beyond the prestige of being able to do it? And I think they believed that being a threshold state, having a nuclear, the ability to at least go from 3.5 or 3.6% enrichment to 60, 80, 90%, the ability to do that gave them a certain amount of leverage. It gave pause to their opponents. And I think they rolled back, they agreed to roll back that leverage, frankly, in 2015 with the Iran nuclear deal. So I think today, the prestige factor still exists. How they're thinking about, I agree with Mohsen, I've seen it myself as well, that what was a sort of a marginal position or extreme position prior to the 12-day war, which was that Iran should make a mad dash for a bomb. That was an extreme position. It's no longer, I don't know if it's mainstream, but it certainly is out in the open now. Yeah. And I think that is something that is going to be playing out in real time, frankly. Part of it, as Mohsen mentioned, again, I hate to agree with him, but it's going to play out. What will partially determine that are the responses of the other actors, Israel and the United States. If there's another follow-on attack, that's going to shift the debate in a significant way, depending upon what the regime looks like at that point. But I think that's the debate that is being had now, is I think they're looking at their entire arsenal of assets. They're looking at I would imagine, looking at their militias and saying, what remember, their militias, they believe created deterrence, right? There's a bit of boomerang effect. Their militias, particularly after, I call it the tail wagging the dog, after October 7th, it was the militias that actually brought Iran and Israel to direct blows with one another. So I think they have to be evaluating the strategic benefit of those assets and the strategic assets of how do they take their current nuclear, whatever's left of their nuclear capability, how can they use that in a way that gives them leverage and doesn't create liabilities for themselves? And sadly, if they're pushed against a wall, they're probably going to make the decision, despite all risks that would entail, maybe to go for a nuclear weapon. So would you mind asking a question where we can disagree with one another?
Well, Ken, I want to ask Ross, what did you have for lunch? You have been agreeing with me too many times.
All right, I want to ask you guys one last question. Mohsen started to talk about it at the end of his answer, and I think it's a very important one. Again, both of you actually see a great deal of continuity in Iranian foreign policy, and again, there's a lot of complementarity in your views. And again, a lot of what you both talk about are these well springs of it. But Mohsen, you just brought into the conversation two important actors, right? And again, I know you're both professors. Political science talks about three images, and you guys mostly dealt with the third, which is the international structure and states' position in it. But Mohsen, you just raised the second and the first. The second image is the nature of governments themselves and their bureaucratic players. And then the first are human personalities, right? And you raised the Guard and you raised Khamenei. And that's the last thing before we move to the audience that I'd like to ask you guys about, which is how do you see the role of Khamenei and the Guard in shaping the direction? Because again, Ross is kind of making this point. I mean, at the end of the day, you both see such continuity in Iranian foreign policy, but of course, history isn't destiny. It may eliminate some possible responses, but you've always got options. Every country always has options, and even as a long historical tradition doesn't mean the state will always react exactly the same way. Typically, they've got two or three ways of moving, and it's oftentimes individual leaders or important bureaucratic actors that may decide whether they choose door number one or door number two, even if they always choose between one and two. So develop the point that you just made, Mohsen, a little bit more about the leader and his likely reaction to what's just happened, and then the Guard. And I raise this obviously because the succession question looms incredibly large. And we do want to have a sense of, okay, how much of Iran's foreign policy and strategy have been driven by Khamenei himself, which will be gone once he is gone? How much of it is being driven by these other actors who will persist even after he's gone?
If you don't mind, Ken, before I answer the question quickly, I want to acknowledge two people here. One is my wife right here, sitting right here, because she was the one who helped me really write this book. Because she knows much more about Iran than I do. I left Iran when I was a little kid, but she was educated in Iran, sitting right there. And she essentially made me a little bit more humble and softened my rough edges. So she read my book at least twice, from page one until the last page. So I'm grateful to her for this. Secondly, you're talking about nuclear issue, and I want to acknowledge the man who's sitting here, Dr. Sina Azadi, right here, raise your hand. He has written a book about Iran's nuclear program that is going to be published, hopefully within a year from now. He is a true expert on Iran. He did his dissertation with me on Iranian nuclear issue. And I have to tell you, what I know about Iran's nuclear issue is because of his dissertation and the role he played in teaching me. Now, going back to your question, I have always believed, and I still do, that you cannot separate Ayatollah Khamenei or the office of the supreme leader from the Revolutionary Guard. There are two sides of the same coin, and it is a huge mistake to think in terms of policy, in terms of developing a strategy, that you can separate these two. It was created, the guards were created from the very beginning to protect the Islamic Revolution. That's why the name Iran does not appear for the Bastara. It is a a force dedicated to protecting the Islamic revolution. And the Islamic revolution is protected only if the supreme leader is protected. So their job is complementary to the role that Ayatollah Khamenei has played. And these two, I think, are going to be the major players in deciding which of those two trends, which of those two blocks will prevail Iran. The bloc that wants to normalize, these are the people who follow Ayatollah or Sheikh al-Islam Rafsanjani, or those who are pushing for nuclear path. The Revolutionary Guard is going to play the key role in deciding who is going to be the next supreme leader, barring no major changes. I did a couple of papers about the succession from Ayatollah Khomeini to Ayatollah Khamenei. And I know quite a bit about the succession process. But now, if you ask me, I'm going to be honest with you. And I know this is the most painful thing an academic or an expert can do, to say, I don't know. I don't know what is going on. Because the shock of the Israeli attack on Iran was so severe. I think Iranians are still disoriented. It's like when you play soccer, you get hit. While you're playing, you don't notice the damage. But once you go to the locker room, you rest, you realize you can't walk anymore. I think Iranians have not gone to the locker room yet. They're still hot. And when they're not hot, that's why I said you're going to see the birth of a new Iran. Whether it's Islamic Republic, I don't care. We're talking about structure. So focus on those two. And for me, these are still the key players in Iran. The attack did not change the structure of the decision-making in Iran, although it has introduced new players who can influence that process.
Ross, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Ken, you portrayed the difference in our books, me looking from the outside in, which I thought was a brilliant way to do it, and Mohsen looking from the inside out. And I think if I do, I can't really answer the question the way Mohsen did, and frankly, understanding or portraying the guards versus the supreme leader. I'm not going to go there. But what I can say, and I think as you know in the book, I look at some possible options for Iran. You know, in our business, if you're a pessimist, you've got gravitas, you've got experience, you've got scars from you know your past, and that's valued. And it's quite risky in our business to be an optimist. So I'm really not an optimist. But what I try to do in the book, and it does relate somewhat to the question about the leadership going forward, I do something that's a bit audacious. I don't predict anything, but I do compare another state outside the Middle East that has made a transition from being an ideologically rigid state, a state that was interventionist in the region, and that's Vietnam. And I asked the question, I don't say that Vietnam is a model for Iran. That would be naive, feckless, and it would not serve the readers well, it certainly serve me well. But I asked the question, I said, wait, how did this happen? If you had asked somebody in 1944, if you said that within 10 years you're going to have this is the end of the Second World War, right? 45 was the end of the war, but in 44, the war was about to end, 45. That within 10 years you'd have a European coal and steel community that tied together the industries of these various combatant countries. And that would be then transition later to a European community, and then in the 90s to a European Union. You say you can't get there from here. And similarly with Vietnam, if you said in the 1970s that that Vietnam would become a responsible country within the ASEAN, within the Southeast Asian community of countries, and that they would make a leadership change internally, you'd say you can't get there from here. But they did. So I asked the question, what would have to happen in terms of leadership dynamics in Iran at a point when we are facing a possible succession? What would have to happen regionally, and what would have to happen globally? So at least we could ask the question, is there a possible different path for Iran? Whether it includes the Revolutionary Guards, Supreme Leader, is there a different path? And I don't predict it. I say at the end of the book, I say I'm devoting this much space to the Vietnam example, not because I think it's the most likely, but because I think it's the least likely. But oftentimes the least likely Then ask the question, what are their strategies for moving Iran in a different direction? And obviously we can't, the international community cannot move Iran. That's for the Iranian people and for the Iranian leadership. But are there things we can do as an international community and as a region to create conducive conditions? Then it's up to history and the Iranian people to make that. And so I use that as kind of an analog for what could possibly be for the future. And so I'm pushing away a little bit from the question about the guards and leadership, but saying that there are possibilities that are a departure from the present that are I think it's an interesting question to ask, what would have to happen to push Iran in a different direction?
Outstanding. All right, let's take some questions. I'm going to try to alternate, again, assuming that the technology cooperates, between folks here in the room and folks online. So for those of you online, if you'd like to ask a question, please just use the raise hand function on Zoom. And we'll start with a ringer in the room. Sina, please.
Thank you.
Hold on, just wait for the micro. Actually, one up there, so the folks online can hear.
Thank you for the great conversation. Two quick questions. Why do you think these non-state actors aligned with Iran, they didn't do anything during the 12-day war? Were they unable to attack, or were they unwilling to fight on Iran's behalf? And secondly, are there any different conclusions that you come to in your books?
Mohsen, why don't you start?
Yeah, well, I try not to use the word proxy in my book. Occasionally, maybe I use once or twice so that the reader understands I know there is something called proxy, but I use non-state actor. And the reason why I didn't is because I never bought this argument that these forces work on behalf of Iran entirely. No, they have their own domestic concerns, their domestic limitations. Regarding Hezbollah, I think the decision, by the way, there is a very good article that came out in one of the European journals answering the question you were asking me, and I read it on the way to here. And he makes an excellent point, Ali Reza, he makes an excellent point that Iran did not want Hezbollah to go far beyond what they did. And I think the reason is because Iran is looking at the war with Israel as a long war. The attack by Israel was not the beginning of the war, it's not the end of the war, the Iranians calculated. And the thing that they wanted, that they were most concerned about, was that they did not want the US to get involved. Now, let me go back to the question. For Hezbollah, I think the decision was made by Iran, and I think Hezbollah agreed not to go far beyond just occasional attack on Israel. But Israel decided that it's a good time to put an end to Hezbollah, so they attacked it. Now, the militias in Iraq are entirely different. Iran did not support the militias in Iraq in order to attack Israel. They're too far from Israel. The Iraqi militias are designed to attack American bases. And Iran did not want to expand that war. And therefore, they did not participate. And if you look at the Iranian thinking, if this is a long war and it's not a short war, why do you want to use all your resources? If you, one of the interesting things, Ken, and I think I discussed that in the book, about 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. I encourage the audience to go and read, not just the chapter I wrote on Lebanon. Read Ross's book after you read mine, of course. But if you read it, I show the similarities between what the Israelis did to Hezbollah and what they did to Iran, with one major difference. The major difference is that in 2006, Qasem Soleimani was there, and he pursued, as I said, both defensive and offensive operations. But the Israeli thinking was that if they can quickly attack Hezbollah, they don't even need to send troops to Lebanon, because the attack would be so massive that Hezbollah is going to be disoriented and therefore the whole thing is going to collapse. Well, this did not happen in Iran, and the Iranians are looking at this at long term. So Hezbollah, yes, I think Hezbollah tried it. They didn't go as far as they wanted, but Iran did not want to use everything it has with Hezbollah. With Iraqi militias, I think they decided, no, don't get involved, because if you do, they're going to beat the hell out of you, and we need you for later on, because the big game is the US. The Houthis also, same thing. Go ahead and attack, but be very limited in your attack. This is why I said Iran is down, but not out, because they haven't used all their power and the power of the non-state actors, because they're looking at this as a long war. The same thing that happened in Iran-Iraq war is happening now. It took Iran about a year and a half before it put the house in order and was able to attack Iraq. I think Iranians are in the phase of recalibration, rethinking, and what comes out of it, I don't know. That's why I said we have entered into a phase of uncertainty, strategic uncertainty. And that's why it's so important to put our investment on those forces that are pushing for normalization rather than the other.
Yeah, I'm not going to duplicate Mohsen's answer, or I'll address the second question you asked. What are some of the differences in the book, between our books? I think largely we come to the same conclusion, which is that Iran is at a particular inflection point now. It cannot recreate the past. It can't go back to the status quo ante. And it has to, the path that it's been on is not sustainable. So I think we agree with that. I think what I tend to do a little bit differently than Mohsen does is I look also at the motivation and the dynamics of the other actors in the region, because those are the ones that also, remember, the way I portray Iran in the book is a master adapter. So they're going to be adapting to the strategies of others. And I think the issue of how Israel has moved from its old, a return, Ken, you clued me into this a couple months ago when I was writing a piece for Al Majalla, is that Israel had a particular doctrine of forward defense. They didn't call it that, but it basically was they needed to control their strategic environment and project power. They, after the Camp David Accords and after certain dynamics in the region, they moved away from that. They're kind of back in that situation. So I think I tend to focus on the fact that the Israeli calculus has changed. The dynamic is so that Iran may be able to rebuild some of the assets that they've had before, but they won't have the same strategic effect. And that, if that's maybe a slight difference, but for the most part, and I think Ken portrayed it accurately, we come at the situation very differently. I look at the patterns of Iranian foreign policy and try to analyze them. Mohsen does a much deeper dive historically, inside out, outside in. We basically come to the same conclusion. Well, and he's right, by the way. We've talked over 4.5 years. We never talked about our books. So the fact that we arrived at the same conclusion says how much impact I've had on his life. And thank you.
And how much my thinking influences conclusions.
I'd say a reminder for those of you online, if you'd like to ask a question, please do use the raise hand function. Since I haven't got one online, we'll take another one here in the room. This gentleman over here.
Thank you both for the very great talk. I have a very quick question, and actually Ken can also contribute to it. Intelligence failure. Obviously, this didn't start in the 12 days war, but I think it dates months, if not years before, especially the Israeli penetration. So my question is two parts. The first one is, why did it happen, and how Iran can fix this situation, because it seems it has been continuing for a long time. Thank you.
I am not familiar with the world of intelligence, and I don't want to answer the question because, frankly, I don't know. But what I can tell you is give you a couple of broad features of what I think has taken place. A lot of people don't know that the Iranian secret police, Savak, was formed in 1957 after the 1953 coup d'etat. And it was built by the CIA and, what people don't know, by the direct support of Israeli Mossad. As a matter of fact, I have used that in my book, the chapter on Gaza, I talk about a very well-known Savak agent who left Iran after the Islamic Revolution. And he is quoted for saying that when Savak was formed and he was an officer there, he quickly realized that the Israeli Mossad is so much superior to the CIA because they know how to make networks, they know how to penetrate, and they look for root causes. And it is in the book, you can go and see it. And this is a statement made by a former Savak agent. So I think the root goes back to 1957, and I don't think all the connections were lost. But secondly, to be honest with you, I think this poverty that we have seen in Iran, which is true about a segment of the Iranian population. Again, the picture you have in various American media that Iran is, people are hungry. To some degree it is true, but let's not exaggerate it. And I think people have taken advantage. The Israelis and Americans and other intelligence agencies have taken advantage of that. And finally, there is the element of some Afghan refugees who've come to Iran and who were fighting in Afghanistan. They might have played a role. I say all of the last two things because of what I have read. I'm not an expert, and please take everything I say as tentative and from somebody who is not an expert. My view is not any better than your own view or any else's view.
Ross, you'll have.
Yeah, just quickly, because I think Ken, maybe you might want to respond to this question too. One of the things that I observed when I was interviewing Iranians, and I think some of this was secondary sources, some of it was primary source, is the degree of duplication within the Iranian political system. Different intelligence bureaus. I knew somebody who was an author, and they had their book sanctioned, meaning it was able to be released. That same person was then arrested by another intelligence bureau. So I think some degree they've built by design duplication into the system in order to create more resilience and make it more impervious to attack. But it may have worked to their disadvantage in this case because there wasn't this sort of Savak-like concentration of effort or concentration of institutional design. It may have worked to their disadvantage where it allowed the penetration to take place. That's just speculation on my part. But Ken, maybe you can.
I will add three very quick points because I don't want to take away from you guys because the spotlight should be on you and rightfully so. Three quick points. First, we should recognize Mossad is an exceptional intelligence agency, all of the Israeli services, Amman as well. Part of this is about Israeli success as much as it is about Iranian failure. Second point, again, none of us really knows exactly what happened, but I do think that it is safe to say, to go back to a point that Mohsen has made several times, I think is bears repeating, which is that there's no question that the disaffection of Iranian society with its regime played a very heavy role. Just some of the stories that we've heard about things that the Israelis were able to do, you can't do that unless you have a large number of people out there who have no use for their own government. Setting up a drone base outside of Tehran, I won't tell the story because I don't want to take the time away. This is not something you can do with a population that is militantly hostile to you, that is militantly enthusiastic about its government. And then the third point is, I am quite certain that at some point, probably in the next, 18 to 36 months, Ronen Bergman will write a phenomenal book on exactly what the Israelis did to Iran, and wait for that book.
And Ken, before you go, because that goes back to the gentleman, I just thought of something that Ross was talking about. I had the pleasure of interviewing the late Prime Minister, Mehdi Bazargan, before he died. I interviewed him in Tehran. It's on tape. I have about 10 hours of tape from this man. Great guy, a true Iranian nationalist. And he was the first prime minister of the revolutionary government appointed by Ayatollah Khomeini. And one of the questions I asked him was about how the new system was established. And he started talking about the beginning of the formation of a new intelligence agencies in Iran. And what he told me, Ken, is absolutely fascinating. And he said that I brought up this issue with Ayatollah Khomeini. I said, look, what we need to do is have a centralized intelligence agency. And he said, Khomeini immediately said, no, I don't want that. And you know why he said he doesn't want it? He said, I don't want that because if you are centralized, it's much easier for the Americans and the Europeans to penetrate us. It seems to me after 45 years, it is now much easier to penetrate if there are parallel institutions of intelligence gathering.
That goes back to the strategy of
Yeah.
diffusion versus strategy of
Yes.
concentration. That's the way the system was set up. And now it's probably working to their disadvantage.
Right, the folks online have militantly on their own decided to pursue a different way of asking questions. So I am going to read some of them to you guys. So a question from Sinas Turan. Given Iran's dire economic problems, what lies behind Iran's continuing resilience in coping with multiple crises, not least currency depreciation and unemployment? Or has the situation worsened so much now that resilience is gone? Mohsen, you want to take that one on?
I think, again, a lot of people don't appreciate the changes that have taken place in Iran in the past 40 years. Iran of today is not the Iran of 1979. And a lot of people are clueless about this. And you have to go to Iran to feel it, to touch it. Now, there is a great deal of discontent. There is more dissatisfaction today than 1979 before the revolution. I was in Iran in August of 1978. As a student, I went back to Iran. I was living in California. I went to Tehran and I went around the neighborhood. I traveled, and it was the beginning of the period when the guerrilla organizations were attacking banks, were burning cars, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of dissatisfaction, nothing like what we have in Iran today. Today, this degree of dissatisfaction is more pervasive, it's deeper, and it's stronger. However, there is a fundamental difference between the Shah's regime and this revolutionary regime. Number one, at the disposal of the Islamic Republic are repressive capabilities that the Shah never had. Basijis, different intelligence agencies. Number two, this government has no compunction about using force against its enemies. It's sort of their religious duties. Number three, and that's the key. That is the key. Number three, it is not enough to be unhappy with your government. You need organization, you need mobilization, and you need to bring on board the critical elements of your society. If you have 10 million young Iranians who oppose this regime, that is not going to be critical. What is critical are the shopkeepers, the bazaris, the industrialists, people with resources. Are they willing to help you? Are they willing to give you the organization you need? And finally, if you're an Iranian, very unhappy with the Islamic Republic, you're a middle-class, educated Iranian, and you're living in Tehran, you're living in Isfahan, you're living in Shiraz, and you have access to the internet, do you really think you're willing to take a big risk when you look at what happened in Iraq, when you look at what happened in Syria, when you look at what happened in Lebanon, when you look at what happened in Libya? You got to be crazy to take that risk. So as long as there is no alternative, viable alternative, the Iranians they got burned in 1979. We demanded democracy, look what we got. So people are not going to accept any kind of promise that, oh, we're going to bring you help. No, that's what the Iraqis were promised, and look what happened. Look at what happened in Syria. So you put all of them together, you realize why we have, relatively speaking, stability in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another piece to it as well, Mohsen, and that is that Iran has been under sanctions almost since the revolution. So that's been a constant for Iran. And they've developed, I say in the book that Iran's been a master adapter, not necessarily a first-rate, maybe a second or third-rate shaper. They've adapted. I mean, in terms of their, yes, the people, they're living in dire economic conditions at various times. Sanctions have had a tremendous negative impact on the society. But they've built this certain amount of resilience into the system over a long period of time. Does it serve the interests of the Iranian people for the future? No, I think we agree upon that. It's not sustainable. But in terms of their ability to survive, now, their ability to survive could be short-lived. It's possible. We don't know. As you say, you're not going to predict, I'm not going to predict what might happen to this regime. But there's a certain amount of resilience that's been built into the system. And if you even think about their foreign policy, something we both wrote about, it's to some degree, it's a poor man's foreign policy, right? It's done asymmetrically and so forth. The challenge today will be that Iran is going to be competing with countries that are not interested necessarily in intervening in Yemen and so forth, unlike Saudi Arabia was in 2015-16. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're wanting to connect their country to the global economy beyond just hydrocarbons. They're going to be wanting to push their Vision 2030 programs and so forth. Iran hasn't done that. They don't have that. They have to be able to do that. So they've built resilience into the system, but they haven't built growth into the system. And they're going to need, with a burgeoning population, highly educated population, progressive population, for the most part, in the major cities anyway, they're going to have to figure out a way to not just be resilient, but to be an engine for growth. Growth in terms of their security, the security interests of the people, but also the economic vitality of the people.
Okay, we only have a few more minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back to Mohsen and Ross and ask them for any closing comments. Anything that we failed to touch on that we really should have. Anything that came up as a result of our conversation that you'd like to add. Mohsen,
Yes,
last thoughts?
there are a lot of things that we haven't discussed. That's why I think it is incumbent upon you to invite me again to come and
With great pleasure,
and
Mohsen.
this time pay me a good amount of honorarium, and I would be more than happy. No, you are a fantastic moderator, Ken, and you ask excellent questions, and I don't have anything to add except one thing. I dedicated my book to my wife, of course, and to the people of the United States and Iran for lasting peace and good friendship. And I have worked all my life as an academic. I've never had any job except university job. I love what I do as a teacher, as a professor. But my goal has always been, I want to see a day when Iran and the United States are friends, based on mutual respect. And because I think America is a wonderful land. It's a beautiful country and beautiful people. And so are the people of Iran. People everywhere are good. So I hope we can have more of that kind of meeting, more that kind of conferences, so that we can bring the two great people of Iran and the United States, and hopefully one day Israel, together and have, again, good old days.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Ross?
I want to thank Ken. You was an incredibly electric kind of environment here. You helped create it. So thank you very much. And I want to really push and say that Mohsen's book is fabulous. It's the second best book on Iran that I've seen over the last number of books. So I encourage. But no, it's been an honor to be here. I think in terms of just the only thing I would counsel, and I tried to do this in the book, is just to be thinking a bit out of the box. There's a tendency in this town to think about Iran in terms of its relationship with Israel, in terms of the nuclear file, in terms of the United States. Iran has a complexity of interests and so forth. And I would argue, and this is something I've engaged with many Russians and Chinese. They say, you know, the United States has a one-dimensional view of Iran. It's about nuclear weapons and Israel. That's it.
Yeah.
We have multiple interests. We have interests in terms of security and so forth. And so we see Iran in a much more multidimensional way. So I would counsel that the United States and all of us should think about Iran multidimensionally, because that's what we need to do. Understand, to Mohsen's point, that most people in the United States want peace. They don't want U.S. involvement in the Middle East to go on ad infinitum. And the Iranian people are people not waiting, but they want to be members of the international community. So I think if we look at and change our lens a little bit, which is what I try to do in the book, and Mohsen does a good job, not quite as good as I do, then I think we will have a better future, hopefully. And hopefully that's the last word, so he can't respond. Right?
Okay, Ken, I have to tell you, if there is one thing that Ross has said which is accurate today, is that my book is second best book. He is right, because the first best book was my first book. So thank you very much.
Before everyone leaves, first, let me ask you to thank them in just a second. Mohsen and Ross did a podcast with our own Brian Katulis on his weekly podcast, Taking the Edge Off the Middle East. That drops in a few days. Please look for that one. And Ross and Mohsen's books will be on sale, and they will be signing them out in our lobby. If you'd like to purchase copies, you're welcome to do so now. Please join me in thanking Mohsen